Good evening and welcome to the Oklahoma City Museum of Art and our members preview for The Sense of Beauty, 6 Centuries of Painting from the Museo de Arte de Ponce and tonight's lecture. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to acknowledge many of our exhibition sponsors, Lawrence H. and Ronna C. Davis, Vicky and David Hunt, Lynn and Ernesto Sanchez, Amalia Miranda Silverstein, Visit OKC, Chuck Wiggin, J. Edward Barth, Leslie and Clifford Hudson, Colonel Dean and Mrs. Jeannie Jackson, and the James Cray Mead family. Please join me in thanking these exhibition sponsors. Our speaker this evening, Iraida Rodríguez-Negrón, serves as the Chief Curator of the Museo de Arte de Ponce. She has curated numerous exhibitions on subjects ranging from the 16th century Italian art, to the 20th century Puerto Rican art. She has also curated, edited, and authored exhibition catalogs for traveling exhibitions, including The Sense of Beauty. Currently, she is leading the reinstallation of the museum's permanent collection, which is scheduled to reopen in 2029. It reads 2028, but, construction. It was changed. Oh, on the slide even. Fantastic. Great. Like me, I'm sure you will all want to visit when this reopening happens, especially after tonight's presentation. So please help me in welcoming to the stage Iraida Rodríguez-Negrón.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I would also like to express my thanks to all the sponsors of the exhibition who made possible what you're going to be able to enjoy if you haven't done it yet in the third floor. Also, I want to thank the team here at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. It has been such a pleasure working with them from day one when we made the first approach. So what you see upstairs is definitely a lot of the result of the effort that they put into this exhibition. So we're very happy to be able to collaborate with them. Today, I decided to talk a little bit about what happens when we start planning an exhibition and how that event affords us the opportunity to look into the works of art in the collection a little bit more closer, something that usually we don't have the opportunity to do otherwise. That's why today, this is one of the objects which is in the exhibition that we're going to be talking about. It's a portrait from the 16th century related to the Spanish court. It's important to keep in mind the strong tradition of portraiture that was developed in Spain, particularly by artists like Titian, Anthony Moore, Alonso Sanchez Coello. And that tradition that was used not only to create the portraits at the Spanish court, but many of the portraits all throughout Europe. That popularity of that type of portrait presented a problem, and it is the fact that there were so many portraits, there were many artists working in the workshops of these masters, creating all these portraits that were sent to different courts, that were sent to different royal families, that sometimes it is quite difficult to determine the authorship of some of them. But we do know that if we do some stylistic analysis, also, as Carmen Bernice, who is a Spanish scholar, has argued, if you take into account not only the costume of the sitter, even the hairstyles and the jewelry, those are cues or clues that can tell you a little bit more about the information of what not only who the artist is, because obviously many of these portraits were not signed, but also the identity of the sitter. So this is one of the tasks that I took upon myself when I started working at Museo de Arte de Ponce in 2022, because when I did my doctoral studies, I focused on Spanish Habsburg portraits, and I knew of this portrait that had come into the collection as an Alonso Sanchez Coello, but immediately after that, the attribution to Alonso Sanchez Coello was questioned. But regardless of that, the painting was acquired in 1959, And here we have a quote from one of the many letters that were exchanged between Julius Held, who was an art advisor, a specialist of Dutch and Flemish Baroque art, who was hired by Louis Aferré, and we will talk a little bit about who Louis Aferré was in a little minute, but he was the founder of our museum, informing him of this portrait that he found, that he recommended Ferré to buy, regardless of the fact that the attribution was still not sure. He didn't have time to devote many hours to do any research to secure this attribution. And the interesting thing is that you see that this letter was dated in 1958. What year are we at today? So how many years have gone by? And the question of the attribution, it's still a mystery. Although I don't think that applies anymore. For a long time, the attribution to Alonso Sanchez Coello was taken away, and it was identified as a portrait of the circle of Alonso Sanchez Coello. So it's like giving another option, but actually not saying anything. Ferré acquired this portrait, like many of the other works in the collection, particularly during those first 2 decades, following these self-imposed guideline that him and Held and his other advisor, Rena Taylor, decided to follow, that they wanted to acquire works of art that were of quality, independent of their fashion in the market, independent of the problem of attributions like this one. So that's what they, regardless of this question that they had, went ahead and followed through with the acquisition of this painting, which is a favorite painting in the collection. But again, I just wanted to show you how opportunities like the exhibitions that you're going to enjoy have allowed us to learn more about these works, and hopefully we will be able to change the attribution completely very soon. So this is the Museo de Arte de Ponce as it stands today. It's located in the south of Puerto Rico, in the city of Ponce. Ponce, it's a cultural center in Puerto Rico. You could say that when Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain, the military center was San Juan, and Ponce was the cultural center of the island. Many of the haciendas and the sugar plantations and the coffee plantations were located in the south. There was a lot of wealth in the south. So that's like the background for the city of Ponce. Why in Ponce? Because our founder, Luis Aferré, this is the interior of our museum, the iconic staircases that you're going to see in one of the paintings upstairs. The founder of our museum, which you see on the left side, Luis Aferré, and here on the right side with his first wife, Lorencita Ramirez de Arellano, he was from Ponce. Very early on, when he was young, he had started to develop this interest in the arts, like he had the opportunity to learn more about the arts. In fact, he was a classically trained pianist. He was also an engineer. He studied at MIT, and he was a philanthropist, as you will see. In the 1950s, he traveled to Europe with his first wife, Lorencita, and they decided that they wanted to create a museum for the people of Puerto Rico. So that's something that we like to highlight, the fact that this was an endeavor that he decided to start collecting to establish a foundation in 1956 for the museum, for the people of Puerto Rico. It wasn't the case like other museums where this private collector, when he died, left the collection for the states or other examples like that. No, he collected for the museum that he established in Ponce in 1959 in a colonial house in the center of Ponce. And you can actually see here some of the rooms that were habilitated to house the collection. Museum opened in January of 1959. 71 works of art were presented in that first exhibition, although he mentions that he bought around 200 works, or they had already around 200 works. Many European masterworks. That idea of acquiring works of art that were of quality, independent of the art market, allowed him to amass an amazing collection of Victorian art. As I'm sure many of you know, that's one of the things that distinguishes the institution, possibly the most important Victorian art collection outside of Great Britain, as well as Baroque art, Italian Baroque art in particular, Spanish Baroque art as well. But from the beginning, Puerto Rican art was also essential in the collection. That's why upstairs, when you go to the first gallery, you're going to find a quote that comes from one of the speeches that he presented, where he stated his vision very clearly. He wanted to make universal harmony, but with Puerto Rican notes. And that's kind of like the essence as well behind the exhibition, that is organized thematically, and you're going to see a selection of artworks that are a representation of what the museum is, that combination between European and Puerto Rican art. These are some of the first works that were presented. Renaissance Flemish paintings, this marvelous painting by Luca Giordano of the St. Luke painting the Virgin, this very popular painting by David Terniers the Younger, a Baroque Flemish artist of St. Anthony, and one of the sketches of one of the pendentives that hold the dome of the Church of Il Gesù in Rome, as well as examples of Puerto Rican art, particularly works by the two great masters, first masters of Puerto Rican art, José Campeche y Jordán, who worked in the 18th century, early 19th, and Francisco y Sestero, who worked on the 19th century, early 20th. Actually, you're going to be able to see some of their works upstairs as well. In fact, Francisco y Sestero, I don't know if you are aware, and this is one of his most popular landscapes, very impressionistic, right? You can appreciate that. It's not in the exhibition because it's currently in long-term loan at the MFA in Boston. So if you have the opportunity to see it, to go to Boston, definitely go and see it there. And Miguel Poi Becerra, who's a Puerto Rican artist who was born in Ponce. He had an academy in Ponce, and he was an important person in the history of the museum because he was the first one who started teaching a teenage Luisa Ferré about the history of art. So we always like to acknowledge that as well because it's very important. Here we see two figures that are essential in the history. I already mentioned Julius Held, a specialist of Dutch and Flemish art historian, and René Taylor, who's a British art historian specialist in Golden Age Spanish art, who Ferré invited to lecture in Puerto Rico, but eventually invited him to become the first curator and also became the first director of the museum. So two people that I always say that, of course, Don Luis was very visionary because to be able to achieve a goal like he did and so successfully, he had to be, but he recognized his limitations. So he surrounded himself with people like these two marvelous scholars, and because of that, they were able to acquire the works that they have in the collection. Again, just to repeat that maxim that they has imposed on themselves. You know that what I want above all are pictures of quality independent of the art market, because when you're creating a museum, you're not creating a museum for the moment, but for forever, right? Going back again to Victorian art, as you will see, we have our beautiful Flaming June that I'm sure that many of you know, or not all of you know by now. When she was acquired in 1963 in a gallery in London, nobody in England wanted it. Nobody. In fact, the original frame, and we'll talk a little bit about that, was sold before the painting. Anyway, we benefited from that, and that's why this formula was so successful for them. Even in 1961, they were already talking about the fact that they were running out of space. There are mentions in the letters of how he had to take some works to his house because he didn't have space in the gallery. It's very interesting because in some of the letters, he explains to Held the different decisions that he made about how to arrange the work of art. So he was acting like a curator at the beginning of the history of the museum as well. So in 1964, he commissioned this new building, which is the building that houses our main galleries at the moment, from Edward Durrell Stone. Does anyone here know Edward Durrell Stone? It's a fabulous architect, disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was born in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I just found that out the other day when we visited Crystal Bridges. There was his name there, and we were like, oh my God. So the coincidences, right? So this wonderful building that even won a prize from the American Institute of Architecture in 1967. Ferré told Durrell Stone that he wanted a building that was modern, but not modernist, and that it could blend with the architecture in Ponce. And that's obviously where the balconies around the second floor come forth. Also, the fact it's very interesting that you see a building, the plan of the building, that is very reminiscent of classical architecture as well, of the temples of the Golden Age in Greece, obviously surrounded by columns as well. And in fact, at one point, a historian of architecture, Fernando Chueca from Spain, declared that it was the Parthenon of the Caribbean. So we're very proud of our building that opened in 1965. We see here the celebrations even attended by the governor at the time, which in fact I have to mention as well that Luis Aferré eventually became governor of Puerto Rico in 1968, from 1968 to 72. So the commitment to Puerto Rico for him was very clear from the beginning, but I think that even though he was governor, even though he was the founder of the pro-statehood party in Puerto Rico, what he did with Museo de Arte de Ponce definitely transcended anything that he could have done in the political sphere. Here we see him in one of the hexagonal galleries that are found on the second floor. The fact that this was his idea, that he wanted to do the hexagonal gallery, so there was more opportunity to open windows and bring more light into the spaces. And here we see some of the Baroque masterpieces, including the Saint Jerome, that you will be able to see upstairs. This is the museum, more images of the museum, and this is actually before a reconstruction that was eventually, a remodeling that was eventually done in 2008, but there was actually a fountain, well actually not one fountain, 3 fountains inside the building, which is something that it's a no-no in museum world, some of the galleries. And this is the museum after the remodeling. We received this donation of this wonderful sculpture by Liechtenstein from the Liechtenstein Foundation. The fountain is not there anymore. Some of the other galleries was European and Puerto Rican paintings, but also very important, the construction of this annex building that is right behind the building. This is the main gallery, it's designed by Durell Stone, where we have all the office spaces, the conservation center that was established in 1979. So we have a conservation center since then, all the storage areas, which came very positive to have all that space after January 2020. January 7th of 2020, a very strong earthquake hit the southern coast of Puerto Rico, or off the southern coast of Puerto Rico, and Ponce, being in the south, obviously was very affected by it. Here we see some of the visible damage that happened, part of the ceiling collapsing. Thankfully, none of the artworks were affected. Only 2 sculptures were minor damage that was fixed in the conservation center. Initially, what they decided was to cover all the paintings with the glassine, like we see here, but the earth wouldn't stop moving. So they decided to move everything off the galleries. This is a painting by Luca Giordano. Around over 800 objects were removed in a period of less than 2 weeks by a team of less than 10 people. So I think the work that they did was marvelous, and thankfully we had the spaces, not only in the storage spaces, but other areas in the annex building that were habilitated to store the works of art safely. So since 2020, it wasn't until 2022 when we started to bring people back to the museum in some safe areas in the annex building, in the hallways of the annex building. We established collaborations with museums in the US, in Europe, special loans, traveling exhibitions like The Sense of Beauty, a collaboration with Museo de Arte de Ponce, de Puerto Rico in San Juan, to be able to keep our collection accessible to the public. And obviously that's why The Sense of Beauty, the project that you will be enjoying, it was such an essential part of our history at the moment. Thankfully, we can celebrate that the rebuilding has already begun, and hopefully we will be able to celebrate the reopening of the museum in early 2029. Which you see here, if we see the 2 images, they did studies on the building. The infrastructure is safe and sound. The building, obviously, when it was created, it didn't follow any specific codes, but it tolerates up and down movement, but not lateral movement. And that is why they're going to create these special bookcases on both sides of the building that is going to add more gallery space to the building, that is going to support any lateral movement if in the future something else happens. So going back to what we came here today, This example, I didn't have anything to do with what we're going to discuss now, but I wanted to bring it because it's a perfect example of how exhibitions afford this possibility and opportunity to learn more about the works of art. This is obviously Flaming June, and I knew you wanted to learn more about Flaming June, so that's why I included her in the presentation. So Flaming June, as I mentioned earlier, she was created in 1895, purchased in 1896, exchanged hands, different owners in the early 20th century. In the 30s, it disappeared. And miraculously, it appeared behind a panel above a fireplace, which is more like a legend than anything, that someone finally rescued her from oblivion, but nobody wanted anything to do with Victorian art at the moment. So this guy took the painting, took it to a framer's shop, sold it for 50 pounds, and moved along. It exchanged hands a little bit a few times later, and the frame was sold before the painting. So that's why we see her, or she arrived in Ponce, and this is a painting that I showed you earlier, with a very basic, ordinary frame. Already you know the one that she has upstairs. Going back to the idea of how exhibitions allow for opportunities to look more into the works of art, and here we see another painting, actually a photograph of when the painting arrived in Ponce, and later on, probably early 90s, again with the same frame in the galleries. And it wasn't until 1996, do the math, that our former 3D conservator, at the moment, they were thinking about a future exhibition in 1996 that was going to take place at the Royal Academy in London to celebrate the centenary of Leighton's death. So a few years earlier, they started discussing the possibility of finding or at least ordering a frame that was similar to the ones that Leighton designed for his paintings, because we know that he designed those specific frames, as you see here. And it wasn't until a conference that our conservator attended in 96 that he saw for the first time this photograph that shows all the paintings that Leighton created to be presented in the summer exhibition of 1895 at the Royal Academy. So it wasn't until 1996 that they were not able to see this photograph that was in the archives, and maybe someone could have found it earlier, but I'm not going to say anything else. But anyway, it's just stressing again the opportunity that these special projects allow to do more findings, to focus more on the works. And they started working on a replica of the painting, of the frame, sorry. At one point, people from Christie's were in the museum in Ponce doing other things, and then went by the conservation center, and obviously they were very interested in what they were doing with the frames, and they got involved with the search for the frame, and they were able to find the original place that made the original frame, and they had sketches and they had moldings of the frames ordered by, designed by Leighton, and they were able to create an exact replica of the frame. And when it traveled to London for the exhibition, it went on its frame. Yes, applause. Applause for Archie. Here we see her. Right, imagine, and they tell me this story, the shock for the audiences that were used to seeing the painting in this smaller frame. They thought that the painting was even smaller when they put it in this glorious tabernacle frame. This is the painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The painting was on loan between 2022 and 2024, and it was very interesting because they gave us the opportunity to place it next to Lacrimae, another work by Leighton that was submitted, one of his last submissions as well, that still has the original frame. You see a little bit slight of a difference in the patina of the frame, because when they did the replica, they decided to leave the gold leaf new and let the nature take its course. So, but it was wonderful to see them reunited for this show at the Met, for the special loan at the Met. One of the other works which you will be able to enjoy in the exhibition is this beautiful painting by Joaquín Sorolla y Bastida, a Spanish artist from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And this was one of the other works that I had the opportunity to study a little bit more when we were organizing the exhibition. When I started reading and paying closer attention to the painting, there's a very interesting story behind the painting as well that has nothing to do with it, but in 1999, it was sent off to New York to be auctioned because at that moment, they were thinking of acquiring other works of art like the Goya that you're going to see upstairs and Zurbarán, etc. But Don Ferré changed his mind while she was on its way to New York, and they returned it back to Ponce, and I'm very happy they did that. So one of the first things that attracted my attention was the date, 1898. And also the fact that in the scholarship, usually they identify the sitter as one of Sorolla's daughters. And I knew that in 1998, these were Sorolla's kids. So impossible that that was Sorolla's daughter. And this is something that we found stated it should be one of Sorolla's daughter, 1898, in the scholarship, like published scholarship for the painting. So definitely no one of Sorolla's daughter. And I'm just going through this so you know how the process that we go through in this, making these discoveries. So then I was thinking, so maybe if it's not his daughter, is his wife Clotilde. And this is a portrait of Clotilde, contemporary with the dating. She was his muse. She appears in so many paintings. And she's very well recognized. It has the style, maybe, but I wasn't convinced. So I decided that I wanted to learn more about the garden because, as you see the title, it says at the pool in the artist's garden. So what was the artist's garden? So the artist's garden is one of the 3 gardens that were created for the Sorolla's house. Any one of you ever gone to Museo Casa Sorolla? Well, it's currently under renovation, so when it reopens, you have to see go and see it because it's one of the most beautiful museums that you'll ever find. This is the house that he lived in Madrid, where he settled in Madrid, his last house where he had his workshop. And learning more about it, I find out that he moved to the residence with his family in 1911. So there we have a different window. This is the window that we're working on with for the date now, 1911 and 1923, the date of his death. So no 1898. So here we see the house again, a closer detail of the house. Is such a beautiful place. And here we have the plan of the house and the 3 different gardens that were designed, and he was involved in the design of the gardens, inspired by the Generalife in Granada and also by the Alcázar in Seville. And these are pictures of the actual gardens like they look now. Beautiful. And this is actually some examples of the many, many, many images of the garden that he painted while he lived there. Many images. These are just 3 of them. Different dating. Many of them don't have signatures nor dates, so it's difficult to be precise about it. But we do know, thanks to Bernardino de Pantorba, who's a Spanish scholar who created his catalogue raisonné. And here, even if it's in Spanish, I'm going to tell you that what he's writing here is that he did numerous studies painted by Sorolla of his gardens in his house, and most of them were created between 1914 and 1920. So the window is closing a little bit more. Looking at the portrait and the painting, it's more like a genre scene. And looking at the gardens, it's very easy to identify which garden. Because if you look to the left side of the character, there's a sculpture here, the lower part of the sculpture, that is actually this sculpture here. It's a sculpture by an artist called Francisco Marco Diaz Pinto. A sculpture called, this is the Garden of the Secrets, of the Sharing of the Secrets, La Fuente de las Confidencias, the Sharing of the Secrets. And it's obvious that the lower part of the sculpture is visible here, which originally was made of gesso. It wasn't made of bronze. Eventually, it was changed, obviously, to make it more, to last more. So we found exactly where she was located. Another very interesting, you can see it very clearly here. So she's sitting right here. Another very interesting detail is this little piece of a basin that we can see still in the garden, even the same type of vegetation. So no 1898. Another thing that I was thinking, it was the title, because even though you can decide a very generic title, like At the Pool in the Artist's Garden, many of the works were identified in the catalogue raisonné as works for the garden at the Casa Sorolla. And in fact, in the back of the painting, you have an inscription en la alberca del jardín de Casa Sorolla. So at the pool in the garden of Casa Sorolla, and this was done by one of his grandchildren. So we have an exact title for the work, as his grandchildren, particularly Blanca Pons Sorolla, are very involved in the legacy of Sorolla, so we have to follow what they wrote behind the painting. And in fact, it also appears in the Catalogue Raisonné by Bernardino de Pantorba, which with the same title. So obviously, this title doesn't go either. And the last detail, as you will see here, I moved the window up to 1915. You know why? Because this little basin, which was dated between 17th century or the 18th century, was placed here in 1915. Ta-da! So this is one of the examples of the things that you're able to find when you look more into these studies. So moving on. Another of the resources that we have to learn more about works of art beyond documentation is technical studies. And in 2024, we were able to organize a small exhibition at Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico with 10 works from our collection that we were able to place next to infrared imaging and X-rays showing the underlying image, la imagen subyacente. And I have to thank a team that came from the University of León, who were specialists in technical documentation and studied 40 paintings in our collection with infrared imaging, which allowed us to find a lot of information behind some of the works, like this painting by Ludovico Mazzolino that I brought, because in this one you can actually see, this is obviously the painting. This is a painting that was originally done on wood and then transferred to canvas. And here you can see the different techniques that are used to study more the underlying image and even the materials that the artist used to create the work of art. Here is an infrared image. Here is an infrared image with transmitted light. What they do is that they illuminate a canvas from behind, so the light comes through, and then they take the picture. And then this is an image with the X-ray. So initially here, you can see what? And this is something that we discovered thanks to the work that we did with the technicians, Spanish technicians, and for the exhibition. There's another figure behind the painting of God the Father. Probably an image of the Virgin, very similar to the Virgins in other compositions by the artist. You cannot appreciate it that well here, but in the image with the transmitted light, you can appreciate more changes in the shape of the head. You can actually see some traces of stenciling in the hands, around the hand, and on the waist of God the Father. I just wanted to stress the fact that one technique can show us a lot of things, but all of them together can tell us all the information. And we were very hopeful that if we took the painting to be X-rayed, we would be able to find a Christ child around here, because we cannot see anything here. But this is the result of the X-ray. You cannot see anything. Does anyone know why? When X-rays are taken, like it happens when they take an X-ray of you, lead, it's a material that artists use a lot, particularly in white pigments, but also for the preparation of the canvases. So it's not allowing the X-ray to go through, and that's why it shows completely white. So we were not successful with the X-ray. But it was amazing to see all that information. Moving along, the Francisco Goya, the portrait of Martin Zapater, which you will see in the exhibition upstairs. Look at all the interesting things that we could see thanks to the X-rays. We found that the X-ray in the center, and this was an X-ray that had been done before, but we were able to confirm the findings with the new techniques. You can actually see a still life behind the painting, a still life with its vase, a table, quite interesting. This is a painting that we know had suffered a lot of damage, and obviously we can confirm it now with this imaging, particularly the infrared image, where you can see where it was actually cut all around, and the large areas of painting that is missing. The interesting thing that it is a painting that has been relined twice. It has 2 canvas added to the back. So at one point the question was like, so where is the still life? Is it in the original canvas that he painted, or is it in one of the other 2 canvases? We don't know for sure. Maybe we need more studies, but we can guess that probably this was a canvas that Goya grabbed when he visited Martin Zapater, who was a very good friend of his from childhood, and did a portrait for him when he visited. Probably there was a painting that was damaged or something. He grabbed it and painted over it, like he did many times with his works and works by other artists. But moving along, now this is the start of the show. We already introduced the portrait attributed to Alonso Sanchez Coello. So I self-imposed to myself the task of figuring out who the artist was. And one of the things that I started looking at, thinking about Carmen Bernice and the study of costume, was specifically the lace color, because this is something that you see a lot in portraits of the period. So just looking at the characteristics, the way that it is folded, the folds inside the lace color, the fact that it is open, it's not touching the cheek, particularly on the left side. These strings that are coming down, which is very unusual. The 3-dimensionality of the face. You see this. This is an artist that had dominated the technique of creating volume, using light and shadow. That is something that you don't see in the work of Alonso Sanchez Coello. So I started looking at those details. This is actually an image of the portrait in the first house of the first place where the museum was located, Ferré with René Taylor. And again, going back to the question of the attribution, and this is exactly the quote that we were talking about, of how they all only wanted to buy works of quality irrespective of the fashion in the market. This is a work by Alonso Sanchez Coello. So looking at the works of Alonso Sanchez Coello, I was convinced that there was no way that this was a work by Alonso Sanchez Coello. Difficult to discern because they painted very similarly. Actually, Alonso Sanchez Coello worked as an apprentice at the workshop of Antonio Moro. And this is a portrait of Isabella Clara Eugenia, the one on the right, the daughter of Philip II. And what do you see? Particularly when we talk about the lace color. It looks as if she's just laying there on a plate. There's absolutely no interest in creating 3-dimensionality around the face of the sitter. The manner of creating the color is completely different. So just by looking at it, I can tell you it's not Alonso Sanchez Coello. This is another work by Alonso Sanchez Coello at the Meadows Museum. So if you visit, you'll be able to see her. The same. The lace color is right on top of the face, like below the face without any space. This is another work by Alonso Sanchez Coello, also at the Prado, of Catalina Micaela, the sister of Isabella Clara Eugenia. So we go back to the painting. And we started to discard the idea that it was possibly Alonso Sanchez Coello. And I started looking at other artists around the court, particularly Antonio Moro. Oh, just to say very quickly, at some point, they started studying the possibility that it could be by this Flemish artist, who is also known as Juan de la Rua. I don't see the similarities here either. Like the manner of painting is nothing at all. At some point, they were very closely associated just because of the style of the costume, but it's very similar for many of the portraits. So that's not a way to decide, like, not the identity nor the identity of the author of the painting. Looking at it more and more, I became obsessed. And I started thinking about Anthony Smoore, as I said earlier. This is a self-portrait of Anthony Smoore. The detail is not that clear, but you see an interest in creating a more realistic folding of the lace color and also the shadows on the left side of the face. This is another portrait by Anthony Smoore that I found at the Prado. And what do you see here? The same color, open, with the folds in the lace, very similar, even though they're smaller. Those strings hanging, which is something you don't see. Not many examples. the interest in the modeling of the face as well, the shadows inside the neck. This is another portrait by Antonio Moro, at the Chicago Art Institute. The same, even if the lace color is different, a different material, it's exactly the same pattern, the modeling of the face. So I was feeling very happy and confident that I was going on the right track. And I found this other portrait by Antonio Moro, or Anthony's Moore, of Anna of Austria, who's the fourth wife of Philip II, sorry. And what do you see? Even closer resemblance between the two. The shadows around the nose and the mouth and the cheek particularly. This is something that we know, and Mary Jordan, who's a specialist in the art of Antonio Moro, has stressed that, how he was very careful in creating that modeling of the face. And then we go back to the face, so I'm very happy about it. And I'm talking to our head conservator, Lydia Aravena, and she tells me, did you know that she has a very amazing X-ray? And I'm like, oh my God. I'm going to show it to you, but just look at it. You can actually see some pentimenti. Does anyone know what pentimenti means? Changes in the composition that eventually come through the painting. So a pentimento, it's in singular. A pentimenti, many changes in the composition. That's an Italian word. Does anyone see anything interesting in the painting? The lips, right? There's a line here that makes you think that there's something strange going on. She has 4 eyes. And that's a change in the composition that at some point wasn't visible, but throughout time comes through. So Lydia takes me to the lab to see the X-ray, and I almost had a heart attack. Because I saw this portrait, and I immediately saw that there's a completely different portrait underneath. You see, the eyes are placed differently. They're downcast eyes, a longer nose, protruding lower lip. The chin is longer as well. And if any of you know the Habsburgs, those are characteristics of the Habsburgs. Look at it. This, just so you know, this is actually a wax seal that is the back of the panel. So that was applied in the 19th century, so don't even look at it. So see, I immediately saw a Habsburg princess. And it was such a surprise to me that in 2022, nobody had mentioned that. It was just amazing. Obviously, I have an advantage because I've seen so many of those portraits because I specialized on the portraits, but still, it was so obvious to me. And then I started thinking of contemporary Habsburg princesses that could be related to the image that is underneath. These two are Maria of Austria and Juana of Austria, the sisters of Philip II, daughters of Emperor Charles V. And this is Anna, who you already met earlier. She's the daughter of Maria, Anne of Austria, and the 4th wife of Philip IV. Very interesting, and I flipped the image of Maria just to put it on the same side because she has a very interesting earring with 2 rings. And you see that in the portrait of the lady with the pink. This is another portrait of Maria, a miniature portrait, the same. So she was a possible candidate, but she was much younger, and I think determining in relation to the costume of the sitter, it is of a later date, so I kind of started discarding her. But it is interesting to see that you see the same type of earring. Then I considered Juana of Austria, but it's very easy to discard her because she has a very particular nose, so it's not her. So then I went back to Anna, and we had already talked about the similarities between this portrait and the portrait of the lady with the pink. And you see it all here. You see the downcast eyes, you see the long nose, the protruding lower lip, which is very, like they were very proud of that lip, the long chin, even the ears, everything. And this is actually a drawing that was published by Almudena Pérez de Tudela in 2009 arguing that possibly this was a drawing done by Antonio Moro, the author of this portrait, when Anna stopped at his workshop when he was on her way from Vienna to Spain to become the wife of Philip II. This portrait that we see here was commissioned by her parents, the emperors in Vienna, so it was a portrait that was taken back. But obviously, when an artist during this time is doing a portrait of one of these royal characters, they don't sit there in the workshop waiting for them to finish the whole portrait. No, they do a sketch, a drawn sketch like this one, or they can also do a painting sketch, because we know that those existed as well. Do I have to say more? This is actually one of the assistant conservators helped me to superimpose the X-ray on top of the portrait of Anna. And we did the same thing with the drawing. Like the eyes, they're fitting on the same place and everything. This image, it's one of the infrared images that were taken by the Spanish team that came to visit, and it's amazing. Because if the X-ray was amazing, the infrared images is even more, because you can actually appreciate the double lips, the nose very clearly, the eyes, and the fact that the eyes are light-colored eyes. They're not dark eyes like the ones on the image on top. But you can see very clearly this resemblance between the eyes of the painting that it's underneath. Taking it even further, they have another technique which is called infrared imaging that they applied ultraviolet light to. And they've been able to identify the different pigments that are used in the paintings through this technique. And what they concluded is that the underlying image, what you see coming through, is actually another color that it's underneath what we see, and it's a light colored hair. So it even more evidence to tell us that probably it could be a painting related. I think that it could be one of the many sketches that the artist kept in his studio, because there were not only drawings, but also oil sketches that have been documented in letters. Almudena Perez de Tudela has written about letters that talk about sketches, that some of them were given to the royal family after the artist died. So this happened. And another aspect that you can actually see very clearly here is the hairstyle, which has completely changed in the later portrait, because the styles were completely different. The styles were higher, like the hairstyles. What happened here? We don't know yet for sure, but it could be a painting that remained in his workshop, and at some point he decided to paint over it, like Goya did with the other portrait of Martin Zapater. And the story gets a little bit more interesting. And then, obviously, I changed the attribution and a little bit of the date for it to coincide, because it's definitely 1570 or maybe a little bit later. I think once I publish, I can remove the attributed to. Look what I found. Looking for more information on Anthony Smoore, I came across this painting that was sold at auction at Christie's London in 2014 for like $5,000. That is another version of Our Lady with the Pink. And the interesting thing is that even the dimensions are very similar as well. So what's the story here? We don't know. But this is definitely a portrait that I would attribute to Antonio Moro without any question. You can even see here even a painting that obviously is damaged, or maybe more the varnish is oxidized. It would look so much better if it was clean, but the way that he does the modeling around the cheek. But if you notice the color, it's a completely different type of color. So what we think is that, what we can theorize is that probably at one point he had that extra canvas, and for some reason, this person that we still haven't been able to identify, they decided to create a newer version of the portrait of the sitter on top of the other portrait, keeping the original lace color that was used for the underlying image. So I think we've achieved a lot of things, but many more questions are open. So we're going to end here with this fabulous note and look out for a publication sometime in the future. And thank you for coming. And I hope you enjoy the show. Now we'll take some questions.
We have time for a few questions.
Yes.
Either I or Iraida will repeat your question because it is being recorded tonight. So please, can you summarize that?
That I started talking about that I started focusing on the color and the modeling of the face and how I started making that connection. Of course, I have an advantage because, as I was saying earlier, I focused on Habsburg portraiture, early modern portraiture. So I've seen so many images. This is what we call in our field connoisseurship. I'm not saying that I'm a connoisseur because that's a big word, but you get used to seeing things so often that they just jump at you immediately. For instance, that X-ray. Once I saw that X-ray, I just I cannot believe that anyone didn't see that before, but it's because I've seen so many of those portraits that I take it for granted. But it is that. It is the experience that you acquire when you're working and doing your research, etc. What happened with the original museum? It was actually, it didn't belong to them. It was a rented house, a colonial house in the center of Ponce. It's currently the cultural center of Ponce. So if you go to Ponce, you can actually go there. And in fact, not so long ago, we were able in 2023 to celebrate Don Luis's birthday by taking a very important portrait in our collection by Antonio Martorell. You know Antonio Martorell, who's a very important painter in Puerto Rico. Take it back to the cultural center in Ponce to show it at the exact place where Martorell met Ferré, and Ferré actually gave a grant to Martorell to go and study. So it's still a very important place in the cultural milieu of Ponce. Thank you for the question. Yeah. He's talking about the God the Father that I showed and why would an artist paint on top of another one? Yeah, materials were expensive. And in fact, as I mentioned, that painting in particular was originally painted on a panel. So panels were even more expensive. And it was accustomed to reuse them either because they didn't need them anymore or they wanted to do something different. Sometimes artists would create works of art to have in their workshop to be sold without having a specific commission. This Goya, in fact, not only repurposed canvases done by other people, because I don't think that was a still life done by Goya, but there are many examples, and if you Google it, you'll be able to find it. I think of the Condesa de Chinchón, that it's at the Prado, that you can actually see another portrait upside down in the X-ray. So that's something very common that happened during the time. Yes. And still happens. I was talking to someone the other day. It's a common practice. That's probably one of his daughters, either Maria or Elena. But the date, now they would have been older. And yeah, definitely. She's asking about the theory that I was trying to debunk, that it was not an 1898 representation of one of the artist's daughter with the feet on the bull, and suggesting that probably it was at the time, if we changed the date, that it could be one of the daughters. And yes, definitely. It could definitely be Maria or Elena. Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know if I have an answer for that. He's asking if there is a reason why Lord Leighton named the painting Flaming June. That's one of those very tricky titles because we don't know of a specific person that was called June. Maybe it's the evocation of the heat at the Mediterranean sunlight, that it's similar to the sun in June. That's one thing that I can think of. But those are the kind of word games that the artists would use. There's no specific meaning to the name, as there is no specific meaning to the painting. Like, that was not the purpose behind the creation of the painting. It was just the purpose was to create something beautiful, which was something very in line with the aesthetic movement of which he was a member of. An interesting anecdote, Ferré purchased the painting in June. Yeah.
I think we have to end things there. Thank you, Iraida.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.